Good evening, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine war. Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center here, and as we have in the past, we're joined by Dr. Yuval Weber, a Distinguished Fellow at the Krulak Center and our Russian subject matter expert at Marine Corps University. But we are also excited to welcome to this special series Dr. Rosella Cappella Zielinski, who you may remember from previous Brewcast episodes. In fact, I think this is the third time we've had you on, if my math on Friday is correct. She's a associate professor of political science at Boston University, a visiting fellow at Clements Center for National Security at UT Austin, and she's also one of the Krulak Center's non-resident fellows. And so we're very happy to have kind of a double header here with our two guests. So what we're going to do here today is it's been a couple weeks since our last episode. Yuval's going to get us up to speed on some of the major developments going on in the war in Ukraine right now. And then why we asked Dr. Zielinski in here is because there's a emerging crisis that's been getting some headlines, and we're getting to the point where it's coming is going to be shifting into it's here. What do we do now? And that's been the concern over the disruption of wheat exports from Ukraine, which is a significant provider to large parts of the world. So it's going to kind of be our focus area today. So Yuval, Rosella, welcome. And Yuval, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Ian. Wonderful to see you again, Rosella. I think you're officially a friend of the pod. First time on the pod, but enough Krulak Center stuff. No, so thank you for that, Ian. And really over the last couple of weeks, there's, let's say, three major items in terms of like the war to bring us up to speed and to really get to the heart of what is today's episode going to be about wheat, weaponization of food, and the impending sort of international food crisis that Rosella will speak much more about. So in terms of what is the larger picture, before we even get to the conflict, we also have the issue of NATO expansion. When we were last speaking, the Finland and Sweden had applied for application. They had applied to join NATO. And although the Finnish president had said that he had secured consent from every other NATO member at that time, it emerged quickly that Turkey, of which we'll hear much more in a consistently negative light over the course of this episode, Turkey came up with a series of objections to Finland and especially to Sweden. And the objections that Finland and Sweden had, even though the Finnish president said that he had gotten approval and support from Erdogan in the negotiations ahead of time, is that Sweden ostensibly supports the PKK, which is a Kurdish separatist organization that also has an armed wing, which is trying to bring down the Turkish state and or provide for its own homeland within Turkey itself. So because of Erdogan trying to destroy everything Kurdish in his country, he is putting a block on Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO right now. So over the last couple of weeks, what we've seen is a series of negotiations between NATO within itself for Turkey, United States, Turkey, Finland, Sweden, and Turkey, all coming into what are several issues. First and foremost, it is Turkey wants Sweden to extradite a number of its Kurdish origin citizens to Turkey to face prosecution, which is a non-starter. It also wants Finland and Sweden to relax and end its weapons exports ban from their countries to Finland. That seems to be the easiest thing. But also, Turkey is using this opportunity to try to get weapons concessions from the United States, both the F-16 and F-35 fighter jets, as well as relaxation of sanctions that had been imposed on Turkey when they bought Russian missile defense, the S-400 system. So it seemed that Finland and Sweden were going to join NATO pretty quickly, which would have really changed the entire European security architecture in the high north with the Arctic, in the Baltic Sea, as well as in, and by diverting Russian attention and manpower away from these southern areas, it would have also changed, obviously, the security situation in the Black Sea as well. So that's the big picture issue in terms of the European security architecture. In terms of the fighting is, in essence, it's World War I-esque. there are trenches. There is reconquering the same pieces of land over and over. The front line goes a couple kilometers west in Russia's favor, and then the next day after a counteroffensive, it goes east in Ukraine's favor. So a lot of the fighting has gone to try to get one of the major cities of the Lugansk Oblast, the Lugansk region, called Severodonetsk, and that place is going to be a lot like Mariupol at the very end of it. There will be a place that exists on a map, but everything that is there will be destroyed. And this is what we've seen in terms of Russia's way of war. Russia's way of war is very destruction forward in terms of breaking a place, reducing it to rubble, so that they break the morale of the defenders. So along Russia's line of control, which now, when we think about looking at the map, how much of Ukraine Russia controls, as President Zelensky said, it is roughly 20% of Ukraine. And on days when Russia's offensives are going much more directly forward, it can get up to 25% of Ukraine being under Russian control. And so what's going to direct basically this summer fighting campaign, as we talked about, I think, last couple of weeks, it's going to be about weaponry. Russia is at this point, they have more soldiers, but they're not getting the fresh ones in quickly, but they have a decisive advantage in terms of heavy artillery. And as I say, the sweat of the artillery saves the blood of the infantry. So the Russians are okay with spending as many soldiers as need be. They have a casualty-intensive way of war, destruction-intensive way of war. They're going to do as much as it takes in order to push Ukraine along this sort of from east to west, and then from southeast up to Kherson and Dnipro. So those are going to be the two main salients. Now that Russia's given up, basically trying to conquer half the country within the span of a week, they've reduced the amount of territory they're trying to control, which is allowing them to fight according to their doctrine as described. So really, this is going to come down to whether the United States and its partners are going to provide Ukraine with the heavy artillery. And as has been mentioned by a number of important people, like Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, the Secretary of State for the United States, Antony Blinken, basically Europe is running out of Soviet-era artillery. So the question now is the basically NATO standard artillery going to get to Ukraine? Is the weaponry going to get to Ukraine? Are they going to be able to push the Russians back? That remains the open question. And really the amount of time is this summer into the next couple months after that, because once the current Russian conscript class graduates, Russia's then going to have another several tens of thousands, if not low 100,000 plus soldiers that are going to be able to relieve the soldiers that are currently fighting. And so when we then think about all of these issues, where is NATO going? How is the fighting going to grind along? What are the weaponry that is going to be seen here? We have seen that over the last couple of days, and this is where we really get to the issues of Rosella and thinking about the weaponization of food and things of this nature, is that what is the war that Russia is trying to fight? And over the last couple of days, President Putin has openly said, because the other day was the 350th birthday of Peter the Great. And Peter the Great said, or Putin said about Peter the Great, when Peter the Great was fighting against Sweden, this is not a war of conquest. This is not a war of annexation, but just the return of lands that always belonged to Russia. They belong to Russia essentially by some version of divine right. So therefore, when we see how Russia has been fighting over the last couple of months, and we have these comments that this stuff, that these areas just belong, and the things in these areas just belong, and the people in these areas just belong to Russia, then we can sort of have a sense that Russia is going for a big war of annexation, and everything on those lands, again, by imperial right, belongs to Russia. And I think this is a good point to sort of pause the idea of where we've gone in terms of the fighting and think about where is, in essence, the issue of grain and food, international food crisis. And I think at this point, I don't know, Ian, if you wanted to ask the questions, or we can just sort of roll in. Rosella, what are we actually seeing in terms of international food crisis and the weaponization of grain and food within Ukraine itself?
Sure. So let me just kind of back up and give some context to wheat production and wheat consumption and where it's coming from, because this isn't going to affect everyone the same. So first, since wheat is something, especially in the United States, we take for granted as a wheat producing state, let me just stress how important wheat is for human civilization. Yes, civilization, back to the Fertile Crescent, millennia ago, you don't have human civilization without wheat or grain, okay? Today, wheat provides about 20% of our daily caloric needs and is the world's most important protein source, providing about 20% of our daily protein intake. So it is critical to our diets. So let me just say that, right? Wheat is critical. Let's elevate it in our importance in our minds. And we really see, and where it's going to affect is developing countries, an increasing demand for wheat because of their population growth over the past couple of decades and urbanization, right? You're not producing wheat when you're living in these cities. So you have a higher demand for imported wheat. Okay. Now, Ukraine is not a top wheat, it is in the top 10 of wheat producing countries. Just for some context, the EU produces about 18% of world wheat production. Within that, France is the most. China, 17%. Most of that is for their own self-consumption. They're actually a wheat importer. India, 14. Russia, I'm going to note 10. US, 6. Ukraine is 3. Ukraine produces a lot, 3% of the world's wheat. Now, who is this going to affect? Well, it's one of the larger exporters of wheat. So they're not just producing it for themselves, which is going to be currently a concern, right? Do they even produce enough to survive right now? But they're really producing for developing countries in Africa and the Middle East. And let me just say a couple of things about Ukrainian wheat on itself. So if you have a map of Ukraine in your head, about the eastern third of that map is your wheat producing region. So Yuval mentioned Dnipro, right? So if you draw a map from Kharkiv, Dnipro, Kherson, and over, that's a lot of what is the grain of Ukraine. So all of this area, as was being mentioned, that's being bombed, World War I, trenches, mined, is destroying this farmland. We were talking earlier before this podcast, and I was stressing that we should not expect the wheat crisis that's brewing, and we'll talk about the blockade in a second, that's brewing because it's being blocked. It's going to actually continue. So we need to prepare for a multi-year event. Farming season in Ukraine is passing. This land is going to be destroyed. It may be bombed out so bad that subsoil is going to be brought up to the surface. Farmers can't, we're already seeing reports, right? They're afraid to farm the land because of mines as well, aside from other dangers. Even if they want to farm the land, we have problems in labor. There's not enough labor. We have, sadly, everyone at a young age who hasn't fled the country or have passed away, been killed, are in fighting forces. So we have a labor shortage that's going to continue for a while. Now, we also have reports of stolen agriculture equipment. That's another problem. So we have now low labor, no land, little agriculture equipment, stolen to little fertilizer, and gas to run the equipment, and fuel shortages. So we are creating a perfect storm for the moment because, again, most of the wheat is being held up because blocking of Ukrainian ports. But this is going to be even worse in the years to come. Oh, and not to mention destroying grain silos. So everything about Ukrainian wheat production is being destroyed.
We've seen, I think, on this, it's worth mentioning that Ukrainian sources, both like on the ground as well as government sources, have reported that everything associated with grain production and export, including one of the few things you didn't mention in that was all the railway equipment, the cars, as well as the granaries that hold it before going out for export. All of these different points along the way for grain production have been targeted. So we can see that part of the war objectives for Russia is to create, in essence, a destruction of one of Ukraine's major export sectors, but also to create the crisis that then focuses attention on what Russia wants, which is pressure on Ukraine to basically stop resisting.
And so let's go into where that source of pressure could come from. And that is those most affected. So those most affected by this wheat crisis, Ukrainian wheat crisis, as mentioned, is African countries and the Middle East, notably Egypt. I think I read something about 80 to 82% of Egyptian grain comes from Ukraine. So Somalia, Benin, and they are all going through, and sadly, their own internal famine and food crises. So this is compounding what is already going on inside. So we have this set of countries that are the most affected. We're seeing already reports of them buying stolen Russian wheat, stolen Ukrainian wheat from Russia. They're most affected, but they're also, sadly, in a position to try to put pressure on Russia or Ukraine, either way, but put pressure on parties involved to ease the situation. We could talk about ways they can do that and what that might look like.
It's also worth mentioning in this context that at the beginning of the conflict, Russia also issued an export ban on its own grains, its own wheat, its own fertilizer in order to maintain domestic supplies. So ostensibly, Russia could say, oh, there's a grain crisis in this world. Why don't we export our surplus? Russia's also not exporting its surplus at the same time that we're talking about these issues as well.
And, as we talk about wheat, I want to, again, let's go to global geography for a second. Why? One could say, well, the United States could export wheat and fill this gap. Or Canada, major wheat producers. India is a major wheat producer. They're having heat waves. They're kind of out. So there are other states that are global wheat producers that could export their wheat. But it's really, really difficult, and the distance matters, right? So freight is complicated right now. So you want to make sure you have the freight to do it, and the port access, and all of these other resources that would make this happen. Now, this also matters. So aside from overcoming the tyranny of distance, all of this affects prices, right? High demand, wheat shortages, global wheat shortages is not a great year for wheat in general, for various reasons. Again, India heat wave being one example. And now we add these high cost of shipping to getting extra wheat to these really far off locations. So is it even feasible to purchase wheat coming from farther afield for these African and Middle Eastern countries? Now, where does the crisis, there's so many crises here. I don't even know, I think that's almost an overused word now. But so where does this mean politically for these states? Well, aside from the worst being food insecurity and famine, political instability. Being able to feed your population and being able to eat, we have seen it in many contexts, wartime and peacetime, is a source of political instability. And that could mean protest, that could mean riots, that could be parties voted out of office, and mass migration. And so the downstream effects of this will be really devastating, beyond, again, just making sure we're getting food in people's mouths. Yes. And so we can talk, if you guys want to talk about some lessons, some things we can do, wherever you want to go.
Right. And one of the sort of directly to that, the Arab Spring, which helped topple long-serving Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak, is that the Mubarak government, during basically a wheat shortage, had, because wheat was becoming much more expensive, decided to reduce the amount of subsidies they provided, to regular Egyptian citizens buying bread, and that in the midst of the issues with, Tunisia and the Arab Spring in those countries, helped create the importation of the revolutionary fervor. And of course, when we think French Revolution, let them eat cake. This is a consistent theme throughout history. If people are hungry, previously extreme political outcomes are now much more within the mainstream, much more plausible. And so that's a core issue that I would like to ask you. When we see, and this may be something that you were going to mention in a different context, but we see lots of countries which are clearly in a food insecure moment. There's a crisis, a global food crisis. What is, in essence, the ability of the United States, Canada, other countries? Where is the international response to this? Is it through the UN? Is it through a smaller amount of countries? What can be done to help Benin stay afloat, Egypt not have a revolution, and things of that nature?
So let me go back to World War I for a second, and let me draw out some lessons that may be applicable here. I actually, my first broadcast a little while back was on the book manuscript I was working on wheat and World War I. So I'm not an agricultural specialist, but I read more than you ever want to know about wheat and World War I. And so for context, again, closing of the Dardanelles, 1914, 1915, cuts off Russian wheat and Ukrainian wheat. And so we have that context that's the same. And again, thinking about the multi-year effect of war on wheat production, France, all those trenches going through France, all that bombing, especially in its northern eastern region, and that's their grain producing region, totally wiped out. And it's wiped out for decades. So we have a lot of similarities. So we have shortages of wheat going to the Allies, mostly France, UK, Italy. Now, the problem here, and you get bread riots, right? Everything I'm talking about, there's a point where the leaders of these countries are so concerned, they're always concerned about the war, but they become more concerned about wheat. They see Russia going through internal turmoil and its revolution because of mismanaged wheat, that they're like, oh my God, that's it. Food security, wheat above the actual war effort. Even in 1918, they actually stopped shipping munitions in favor of shipping wheat. So I just really want to stress how important this is, that feeding your people and eating was more important for a moment than the actual war effort itself and munitions. Okay, so what these allied countries do, the United States, France, Italy, and eventually everybody else, is they start to coordinate their wheat purchases. They realize it's not just supply, it's prices. And that's why I keep bringing up shipping and I keep bringing up prices, because prices, being priced out of being able to eat, is equally as important as not having the food in front of you, right? Same thing. And so they're like, well, we need to figure out a way to lower prices and to coordinate our demand so everyone's getting enough food to meet their caloric intake. Now, they do that by working together and creating a monopsony and becoming a single buyer in the wheat market and saying, listen, if we're going to buy wheat from United States, European countries, from Canada, from Argentina, we need to act as one and we need to coordinate. So that way, no one's bidding past each other. So what these countries, if they have a little bit of the market power to do, should think about how to speak as one voice. So that's the first thing. If their wheat purchases are coming from one place, let's start to coordinate amongst ourselves in the middle of this crisis and not just try to secure wheat past each other. So that's the first thing I would say could be a potential lesson here. That could come from below, from their own efforts, or it could be a US-led or UN-led. But thinking about how they can work together and gain some agency in this moment. Those countries that may have surplus, either nearby or through shipping or whatever, should sell to these countries at a fair price, right? And have a one price for every country involved. And that way, again, keep prices down, make it accessible, and alleviate some of the prices, obviously within this like capitalist market system, aside from just food aid itself. So it can come from anywhere. And interestingly, right, and this could be pressure either on Ukraine, and Yuval might want to stress this, it could be pressure on Russia, it could be pressure on European mediators, wherever this needs to come from. The more we can act as one, the more we can lower prices and get what we need to the countries in question. Zielinski he's very aware of this, right? And he has been ringing this alarm bell for a couple of weeks. And he was like, listen, Russia provokes a global wheat crisis, but really, again, affecting immediately the Middle East and Africa, and saying, there's a crisis here, they need to be working together. And he called on all elite, business elite, political elite to start taking action. I know, my wheat is just conversation so amazing. Even Ian's kids want to hear this.
The wheat sweat brings all the
Anyway, so
boys to
yeah.
the yard.
But yeah, so thinking about how to coordinate, thinking where that is, Yuval and I, and he can speak to this about Turkey, maybe leading some mediation efforts here, although I haven't seen any movement on this, but to try to break this blockade and get some wheat out of for these countries.
Sure, and I think sort of like for the context, what you're referring to is that the current impasse is that essentially several things have happened leading to the shortage. One is that Russia is imposing a blockade on Ukraine in the Black Sea. And all of this, again, when we refer to like the map of Ukraine that we've seen a number of times, Ukraine's access to the Black Sea is not as wide as it used to be. And so Russia has a blockade around Ukraine's ports. So what Ukraine has done is it has mined the area around Odessa in particular. So Russia's position is if only Ukraine were to demine the areas around Odessa, well, then we can get all the grain flowing out. We can solve this food crisis. Ukraine's position is you are not trustworthy people, and we cannot trust you not to take military advantage of this and not try to to engage in an amphibious assault upon Odessa and cut off all of Ukraine from the Black Sea. So in that, Turkey has once again inserted itself into the group chat by proposing that it would do some of the demining in order to be this trusted third party to help bring the grain out of Ukraine. And again, part of that is Turkey is not maybe the most trustworthy third-party candidate here, specifically because it is not helping NATO on issues that Ukraine would like. And by slowing down the, let's say, combined or joint actions of NATO and of the Western partners, it also seems to be taking the side of Russia in terms of getting the grain out on terms that are favorable to Russia. And there also have been reports that Turkey is buying the grain that has been taken from or stolen from Ukraine itself. So in all of these things, there are solutions that are available, but there isn't the pressure that is being placed on Turkey or Russia to do anything. And this is where Ukraine is getting its source of irritation, is that it is expected to be the one to concede on these issues first.
You know, it's funny listening to you talk and all these excellent points just made me realize how focused we are on the moment. And all of this absolutely valid 100%, but I'm just now that I've really thought about this more, this is going to be a problem for a very long time. A very long time. And we've talked about it, and you can, talk about how long you anticipate, predictions about how long this war is going to go. But even if we solved this tomorrow, I don't see this getting better. Let me rephrase, even if we got the grain sitting at the port to those that need it, which is a relief, I'm not sure how this is going to look year 2 or year 3 from now. And I'm getting increasingly concerned. But we're so focused on the moment we have current mouths to feed that even if even if there's a deal brokered, right, which sounds very not likely, what are we going to do for Ukraine to supplement Ukrainian wheat next year? I know we don't have an answer. I'm concerned, and that should be highlighted and blasted out more.
Sure. And so if we sort of then think, barring US Navy or NATO ships go in and basically provide armed convoys to get this grain out, to apply basically the World War I example, and you sort of had sussed out like what are the different blocks, but it would be something to the effect of, when you put all that together, it is the United States, EU, UN all together providing emergency humanitarian relief right now, which means that there has to be a worldwide coordination of shipping, which means that there has to be a imposition that this shipping is more important than regular commercial shipping. At the same time, that whatever is being produced in the United States and Canada to be exported, essentially to create more planting now, to have more grain in the next season, to have greater production, greater shipping, to have none of that be disturbed by anything else that's going on in the world, to not essentially continue inflationary issues and things of that nature. And you just wonder, where does the political will come from to provide the state capacity to put these things in action right now? And that
And
seems to be like, at least to me, like one of the more frightening aspects is Benin going to be important enough? Is Egypt important enough to have all of these really difficult decisions be made and then implemented by those whom, as you said at the very beginning, are not the ones who are acutely affected by this?
yes, I mean, incredibly succinct summary there, Yuval. Very impressive. But yeah, and that's what that's why as we talk this out, I realized these countries are going to be left behind, I think. And that's sad. But it doesn't have to be. And there is a political moment. And the only way out of this is coordinating. It's coordinating. And we have to coordinate. And again, where that comes from could be a Western led, it could be a non-Western led, but there will be some kind absolutely necessary coordinating. And I'm not trying to put this on Transcom. US Transcom has done amazing things. And I'm sure they don't need one more lift effort. But someone is going to need to figure out, where to get surplus wheat and how they're going to get it there, because without the transportation piece, the whole conversation's moot.
Yeah, no, I think you're bless Transcom, because I think they have handled more unexpected stuff in the last couple of years than they ever imagined, and it's really a testament to the just the power and capability of global strategic lift that they can bring, but like they can't be the answer to everything. And so as you're talking about like the multi-year thing, I'm wondering in terms of the political will, like even if the will were there, if the will were there, and like both the political will and sort of the goodwill, for those potential suppliers like the U.S. and Canada, and other nations, do you think there's the economic resilience on their part right now to start these significant shifts? Because we talked a little bit earlier here before we recorded. Things are not great over here either. I mean, we have enough food to eat, right? But it's getting more expensive. There have been shortages. At least on the U.S. side, we're dealing with rising inflation, which is hurting purchasing power. Dealing with rising gas prices, which for that shipping and that freight, that's going to make all of that more expensive. And we are, the world is still feeling supply chain shocks from COVID, right? That stuff has not caught up. So even if the willpower is there, do you think that the systems that would have to provide that surplus and that excess and then absorb the additional cost, the additional debt, the additional diversion of resources to different things, do you think we have the resilience to execute that and
So
not have some other knock-on effects?
I would say no. I don't know. I like to be an optimist. Like, I know the realist in me takes over all the time and the pragmatist, but I'm gonna hope so, yes. Although my husband says hope is not a plan, so maybe not. But let's go back to World War I for a second, right? These are the allies of Europe who are experiencing this wheat crisis. It takes them 2 years to actually get it together and create a body in which that allows them to coordinate all of these sweet stuff, right? To say, all right, we're going to take away our sovereignty on this issue. We're going to let this body and, the 3, 4, 5 people who are representing it take over and dictate food prices, food transportation, who orders what and needs. So it takes the Allies 2 years to kind of get to that place. Almost 3, really, by the time the machinery, right? They negotiated 1916, it's put into place 1917, 3 years. So that's how long it took. And you can imagine, right? Bread riots in Italy, prices are obscenely high in the UK. We know the people in France are suffering. So that pressure cooker of World War I takes that long to get it together. So while there are models, there are templates, there are all these things we can interact, I don't know. It's not looking great.
Cooperation is always a choice.
Right.
And what I'm afraid of when hearing you talk, it's that we'll go through everything before we get to the thing that was obvious from the get-go, but would impose the slightest bit of pain at home, or just sort of when I say pain, I just mean like increased costs, which obviously like goes into like inflation as the issue of the day. But ultimately, there's no silver bullet. It's just making the sacrifice and then finding, in essence, the small amount of like technical expertise to then say, here's how we're going to implement the political will.
Well, let me go back to Turkey. So, I don't know much about Turkish wheat, but they are a wheat exporter, right? They're local, right? So there are, Kazakhstan, Turkey, if they have enough surplus that we could then supplement elsewhere, right? Those are some potential solutions to start to ship wheat over there. And I don't know what Turkey is down, I don't know their export market and who's buying Turkish wheat and what they're willing to do. But if this corridor doesn't open, we can put it, there's an ask there from Turkey to say, you're a wheat exporter, you have wheat. You might not be able to open this. Will you help out? Not to, but.
Yeah, so certainly like, and I think bringing in an idea that you had from before is what are the export subsidies that, let's say, the US and its allies can provide to Turkey, Kazakhstan, others in order to provide for export of like grains, wheat, things of that nature that is consistent with WTO rules because it is for humanitarian purpose and not in the normal course of commercial enterprise.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if you have other questions, but I will say this quote that I came across. We don't use it in the book, but it struck me as so poignant. So bear with me, folks. History celebrates the battlefields whereon we meet our death, but scorns the plowed fields whereby we thrive. It knows the name of kings' bastard children, but cannot tell us the origin of wheat. That is the way of the human folly. And it spoke to me. It's by a French entomologist, Jean-Henri Fabre, but it spoke to me. I'm like, oh, I know so many battles. I can tell you battlefields. I can tell you political elites, but I can tell you nothing about wheat. And clearly, we need to know about wheat because it's connected to political stability and elites, because it's both the cause of battle and results shortages from battle. So this quote, like, I love it because it gets these three things that are just so clearly connected: political order, food, and warfare.
Yeah, well, it's daunting to think that we're this has something like this has happened before, and we're just talking about, again, before the recording, the wheat had impacts. The collapse of Russia, among other things, in World War One was an internal turmoil caused by that, and I think we're in the last few years, and especially watching since February, we're reliving things that like multiple generations have not felt, and so there's no sort of fresh institutional memory on how to do anything or how to deal with it, because maybe we just never thought we'd be in this position again. But hey, it turns out from pandemics to global food shortages to naked wars of conquest that we're not done with that yet, if ever.
Bring back the 19th century, bring back World War One. Just hearing about you sort of talk about the destruction of Ukraine in this essence. I was recently in Europe, and I read about yet another field in Belgium, where basically like farmers doing the business, and they found an unexploded shell from World War One. And you then think, what is the amount of unexploded ordnance that's inside Ukraine right now? And what is the environmental like impact? And you talked about there's so much bombing that like the subsoil is coming to the top. That's going to be an issue when, as you were saying earlier, what's going to be the multi-year effect of this is that there's probably a lot of uranium, a lot of unexploded ordnance inside the fields of eastern Ukraine. And so when will, in essence, the status quo ex ante come back? And like that to me is just thinking, oh my God, is there going to be a farmer in Ukraine in like 2082 being like, oh shoot, we need to find like the bomb robots to like take care of this?
Well, I mean, we just had D-Day, right? And I'm sure many of you have toured a battlefield in Europe, right? And if you look, you saw images from D-Day if you haven't seen it yourself, right? You can see all on the hills overlooking the beaches, and I've been lucky enough to go out to Normandy myself, right? It's just pockmarked. It's completely pockmarked. Still to this day. And we still hear about farmers in France from the Battle of the Somme or Verdun finding all of this ordnance. So I wish I remembered how long it took, but it took France a couple of decades to get their farmland back up and running. So I wouldn't be surprised if this does take Ukraine. Best case scenario, war ends tomorrow, years to get this solved.
Yeah, I as we're telling stories, I've after college, before I went to basic school, my parents took me on a 2-week tour of battlefields in France and Belgium, and I saw the Normandy stuff you're talking about, but I remember very vividly going to Vimy Ridge, which I'm why was I there at a Canadian site? Well, my background is half Canadian, half American, so it was of interest. But to your points, we drove by farms where they have their little stacks of shells that they pulled up that year, and the fact that there's like a basic civic TTP of disposing of unexploded ordnance from 100 years ago is just not something we on this side of the ocean have no capacity to understand that.
But to this point of our being on this side, and it reminded me of thinking about this, I'm interested in when do we sacrifice and what do we sacrifice for? And I think studying war, we talk about sacrifice a lot. And earlier it was brought up with inflation, with political discord, right? Are we going to be able to sacrifice with our high fuel prices to support the war in Ukraine, right? So we're already thinking it's being internalized. But the United States was very in tune to the European wheat problems. They had save wheat campaigns all throughout World War I to help preserve American wheat to be shipped over. So one of the posters I really like, food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help preserve it. Wheat is needed for the Allies, waste nothing. Another one I like, will you help the women of France save wheat? So there is precedent. I know our memories are short, but there is precedent for sacrificing wheat, right? Eating less, finding substitutes. And this precedent, around the globe can be done. It can be enacted. We just need to remember that it can be done.
Yeah, and I think if we're trying to look at some positive stuff, also I think it's fair to say that our ability to generate higher production on the same amount of land has probably only gone up since World War I in terms of whether it's better fertilizers or more efficiency or even the use of GPS guided unmanned tractors to do more efficient plowing and planting. We've learned a lot about how to make wheat in the 100 years since. So it may be really time to put that to the test. And going back to the farmers' fields, given the Russian dud rate of munitions, they're probably going to be digging stuff up from those fields for a long time. So we're going to have to figure out how to maximize our ability to offset that.
It's a guy's business idea. We form a firm, a UXO, unexploded ordnance. We're just going into Ukraine. Next couple of decades, we're just digging Russian duds out of the earth. Endless business. What do you think?
You jest, but there may be. I only say that because my memories from Iraq and Afghanistan, where certainly the standard of living is different than Ukraine versus Iraq and Afghanistan, but there are markets for scrap metal, for excess explosives, not always good markets, but the volume of metal that's now buried in the earth, wars generate their own industries, right? Which is why we would have scrappers looking to catch 50 cal casings from our helicopters when we were testing our guns, because there was a market for it. So it could be there's some sort of market force that will help remove UXO from all of those fields and get them back into into production sooner maybe than later. We can hope.
I'll put that on the whiteboard. Next episode, we'll come back to it.
Okay, yeah, we'll do some brainstorming in the meantime. Actually, but so before, unless you have anything else for Rosella, I did have kind of one thing to. We've been looking a lot on the stresses on the obviously the impact on Ukrainian GDP and industry and just overall is bad, and the cascading effects of loss of wheat economically and in terms of civic stability and the consumers also bad. But we've talked about this before. There are lots of different clocks running here. Maybe Yuval, if you could sort of give us an update on the conditions in the Russian economy side now, because one of the clocks running is how much longer can their economy absorb the sanctions, the burn rate of their saved war chest, compared to the clock of when does the food crisis become critical, or when do the Western supporting countries really have to make hard decisions about it? Where's the Russian economic clock right now? And you also talked about the manpower situation, right? Like looking new draft class coming through the summer. There's a clock ticking there as well. But what does the Russian economic clock look like right now?
So sure. So in essence, when we think about the war, it began in February. We're now in the 4th month of the conflict. In terms of the data that's coming from Russian official sources, as well as economists who still live in, like Russian economists in Russia, the estimation is that when you look at the big picture, there's at least a year of Russia left, sort of in its context. And when I say like the big picture context, the shortages on industrial production are already basically at a critical level. The Russians are living worse than before in terms of all those sort of like major indicators. There isn't yet food shortages in the cities, but one of the sort of like canaries in the coal mine that I always look towards is what is regional indebtedness, because like Moscow, St. Petersburg are wealthy places. There's plenty of money in like those cities. It is in the regions of Russia that indebtedness is now reaching basically year over year more than 30% above, like sort of on average in most parts of the country in terms of the increased indebtedness. That money has to come from somewhere, or else we get a run on the bank. We can also see that in terms of Russia's actual like central government spending, they're spending about 40% more year over year in the last couple of months compared to the previous year, which is roughly attributable to military spending plus bailing out the economy. Indebtedness of people. One of the sort of curious statistics that I came across is that 70% of personal and household debt in Russia is held by the people who do not live in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and 45% of all positive bank balances in Russia are held by people who live in just those two cities. So what we're going to see is not like this one moment in which like Russia falls apart like some jalopy where like, the windshield bumps out and like the wheels fall out, but just an economy of shortages, an economy of things not working, an economy of things not being available become apparent already, like right now. And that would just become more dramatic over the course of basically the rest of 22 and into the first quarter of 2023. And that's why, in essence, the next basically 3 months are the most important. The next conscript class will be coming online sometime in September, October, November. The Russian economy basically has until that time, maybe until the beginning of 2023, before basically the emergencies are in. That's why Russia's trying to win as much as possible, as quickly as possible in a short war, because in a long war, they are not going to do very well, because the long war favors the Ukrainians who have more basically soldiers and ostensibly more weaponry coming in. And that is basically the timelines that we're seeing. Russia needs to win this summer. Ukraine needs to not lose this summer.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks for that. And I think in the future episodes we'll be looking on sort of where those clocks are running on all sides, because this is kind of a sidebar, but talking about the issues of long and short wars, this has been a recurring theme in some of like the the military discussion threads that I hang out on, and there's just this sort of mind-boggling, like, historical. It's a vampire idea because it keeps coming back and it won't die, but people keep trying it. The notion that you can have like a short, sharp war, and um, and that it's possible to have a complete victory in a short time. And the historical precedent for that is not great. Short wars almost always turn into longer wars, which then become a battle of resilience and attrition, in the sense of who can afford to lose more and who can regenerate more over time. So I think this will be another little data point that the short, sharp war just is not a thing.
And I think in the next episode, we will call upon the work of Jeffrey Blaney and Jim Fearon to talk about what causes short versus long wars. Is it a problem where we don't know the resolve of the other side or the capabilities of the other side? Or do we not trust what the post-war outcome will look like? Can we not trust the others to commit to particular post-war outcomes? And I think that may be a way of thinking about these time horizons, running these clocks, the conflict, and then one of the main drivers, which is the state of the Russian economy. And I think that may be a good subject for next week.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. A good thing to look at. I have one more point, and this is going to be a terrible pun, so I ask you to forgive me in advance. But as we've been talking about food production, fertilizer plays a role. And there's been another type of fertilizer that's been in the news recently, and that's the stuff that comes out of Vladimir Putin. I've been seeing a couple of these stories about his security detail basically having little doggy bags to do a little poop scoop wherever he goes, at home or abroad, and take it back with them so that foreign intelligence can't comb through or do whatever it is they want to do on Putin's number two. So my question to you is, is there any credence to these, to your knowledge? Two, if there is, what does that indicate about Putin's like mind space right now? And then maybe a three is, there have also been, regular rumors that Putin's health is not good. Is this a possible indicator that he is really trying to keep from public view some serious problem that's affecting his body?
Roselle, I'll spare you the smelly situation that you don't have to step in it. And to say this, that so Kim Jong-un also like travels in the same way. As we know from basically like modern medical technology, a lot can be said about a person's health from their poop. And so I think it's probably very clear that, I mean, the icy hand of death comes for us all. And Putin has led a very stressful life. He's not like super old, but I mean, he is getting up there. He's older than the average life expectancy of a Russian male. Is had a very stressful life. We also know from historical record that when Khrushchev came to the United States during his trip, that the CIA did intersect his feces in order to basically see like what was the health of the person. One of the reasons that Putin was always meeting with people across those like ridiculously long tables is because they weren't doing like those biomedical swabs. A lot can be said about a person's health, their medical history, from their saliva, from their fingerprints, from their feces, from their urine. And so Putin is just taking it to its logical extreme. If his person is basically the safety of Russia, then anything that can be done to safeguard foreign hands from his person and his production is something that is a security issue for Russia. And I'm sure that if someone was actually able to get his poop, they would see exactly how sick he is. And that information could then lead into a very different bargaining environment for Russia vis-a-vis its adversaries. Because if people knew this guy only has 6 months to a year left to live, how does that change the way that other countries interact with Russia?
That's another clock.
Another clock.
Yeah.
That's the dirty clock.
Yeah. Well, at least they're not, using the line that I remember from the movie The Interview, where they said about Kim Jong Un, he doesn't poop, right? He's too busy and too grand to do that stuff. So, um, at least we know Putin is a mere mortal after all. All right. On that note, any final closing thoughts from either of you?
Everybody poops.
Everybody poops.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. I'm gonna have to check the e-box on Anchor when I post this, just so everybody's ready for the conversation. Okay. Well, to both of you, thank you very much for joining. I know it's kind of off hours and the weekend's about to start, but it's good that we're keeping this habit pattern going. Rosella, especially, thanks for sort of shanghaied you in here, but always appreciate your willingness to come and share your insights with us. And, I think it's another testament to the support that the non-resident fellows can give for the Krulak Center, and that we're able to have access to fantastic knowledge and expertise from both of you. And actually, one thing about this, you both just mentioned something about book manuscripts. And Yuval, you said you just finished yours. So maybe do you just want to kind of give us a quick update on where those projects are, when we can expect them to hit the streets?
I'll go first. Feeding Allies, War and Wheat in World War I with Paul Post. It's doing a second round of reviews in academic world. So hopefully sooner than later. And I will definitely blast out if we get a book contract in the next week or two, tag the Krulak Center, a good friend of this book manuscript all along. And if you are interested in wheat in World War I did a broadcast, again, a couple years ago on it. So you can get some of the juicy bits there. The weedy bits.
There you go. No, that's a good point. And in fact, I think I'll make sure to make a link back to that in the notes for this episode. So folks can have everything right at their fingertips. And Yuval, you just said you just slapped the table on one, right?
Yeah, so I'm in the same one, just turned in. So second revisions, you write a book, you send it to the referees. Famously, reviewer 2 has a reputation within academia. Just to give you a sense of how vicious the second reviewer can be, mine challenged my uncited assertion that Vladimir Lenin was a prolific writer on socialist governance, to give you a sense of what my life has been like over the last couple of weeks.
Wait, Yuval, tell us the title.
I don't even remember what it is right now, but I think it is The Russian Economy.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so it's because so it's part of it's called The Russian Economy, and what I really wanted to title it was Russia's turns to the market, because the argument of the book is that Russia has engaged a number of times in pro-market economic reform in the Tsar's times, in Soviet times, as well as in contemporary Russian Federation times, but that these market reforms are not sincere, but are only pursued when Russia's external security environment is so threatening that this is the last available option. And so basically the book is talking about how is the Russian economy run, which is basically about Russian political culture, which I think we'll talk about in the next episode. And it has a lot on Peter the Great, which is very timely. But ultimately it argues that Russia fundamentally cannot do the market. And it can't do the market because it cuts into the ability of the Tsar or General Secretary or President to pick and choose winners in the economy. And picking and choosing winners in the economy is one of the key things that every autocrat must have. And that's why Russia's on what's famous in the Russia studies world, on a treadmill of reform.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah, no, we look forward to that. And the way you characterize it just reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from GoldenEye, where you've got Russian former KGB / entrepreneur after the fall complaining about how the free market economy is going to be the end of him. But he's trying to adapt, but his KGB mind just can't quite accept that he may not have full control over it. So, and sorry, I can hear my son talking about some sort of shapes in the background. So maybe that's a sign that we're at a good stopping point. All right. Well, again, thank you both very much. Enjoy your weekend, and I will get this out as soon as I can.
All right. Take care, guys. Be well. Bye.
Bye.